Disclaimer, I am playing a hyperbolized myself, a character, in this video. I don't hate anyone mentioned. I am just impassioned. If you harass, you go to hell.
You know, this next video wasn't supposed to be about Deltarune, but I happened upon this video, and it scorned me. It was as if an old enemy had crawled out of a grave and clasped my arm, gripping it tightly, before I let the thing have its way with me. This time? Well, not again. Today we are talking about Kris Slash Theory, as presented by the guy who popularized it. A brief summation of everything important. At the end of chapter 3, you fight the Knight. The Knight is also the secret boss. After defeating the Knight, this happens. One naturally concludes this is the Knight clobbering the party and spraying Kris for an insidious reason, but maybe there is more to it than that. Kris Slash Theory is that proposition of more. According to Kris Slash Theory, Kris is the one clobbering the party instead of the Knight. Why might that be? Mike! The evidence, please. In the sword route minigame, Kris kills Susie and Ralsei. Kris slashing the party is the only plausible parallel to that. The Knight is on the right side of the screen, and the slash is angled from the left to the right, thus meaning it can't be an attack from the Knight. Ralsei, because of his prophecy know-how, is aware of the difference between Kris and the player and decides not to say anything about the slash. Toriel's dialogue when defeating the Knight implies something bad happened or is happening. Kris is a secondary Knight, attaining knighthood status by slashing Susie and Ralsei. Plausible, right? Wrong! Hidden within this argument is blatant indulgence in semantics and convolution. It harkens back to the terror of the Kris Knighters, those that defended their idea on the grounds that nothing disproved the theory either, the default assumption. What else could a TV being plugged in mean? Basically, I think the argument for Kris Slash Theory is Kris Knight 2.0 and is bad for similar reasons that Kris Knight was bad. Kris must attack Susie and Ralsei to progress in the third minigame. You have to go through these minigames to get the Shadow Mantle, meaning Toby wanted us to see this before fighting the Knight, and there is nothing else in the game currently that parallels Kris killing Susie and Ralsei unless you believe in Kris Slash. He also addresses the two obvious counter-arguments, that being the minigames are an allegory for the weird route.
It's taking on the heavy assumption that everything in these secret minigames is only about the weird route.
And Kris killing their friends is foreshadowing for future events in the weird route.
But these would be predictions. This doesn't have a direct parallel in the games unless Kris Slash is true.
Something irks me about the way he conveys his points, but beyond that, these minigames are explicitly an allegory for the weird route. I will focus on the third minigame since that is the point of contention. What is the first major deviation from normal Deltarune progression in the weird route? The Snowgrave scene. In the Snowgrave scene, we force Kris to force someone else, in this case Noelle, to kill that someone else's friend in the name of becoming stronger. Afterwards, we walk down a peculiar alleyway with a manhole at the end of it. Returning to the third sword route minigame, what are we doing? We're forcing Kris to force someone else, in this case the Pixel Kris, to kill that someone else's two friends so they may become stronger. After that, we walk down an identical copy of the alleyway from before. We have an exact parallel to the first major deviation of the weird route. Taking it a step further, I believe the sword route minigames are a hint for those unaware of the weird route to do the weird route. The first minigame involves killing monsters to become stronger, a reincorporation from Undertale's genocide. The second minigame shows the Ice Mage using ice magic to kill things you couldn't kill before. Killing Darkners is impossible without Noelle's help. The third minigame shows you the consequence of this action. You will need to hurt your friends to progress. Given all of this and more, like John Mantle's acknowledgement of the weird route and Kris's clear discomfort when being forced to hurt their friends, it is impossible to interpret these minigames as anything other than allegory for the weird route. It is especially outlandish to jump the shark and believe that the player forcing Kris to kill their friends is foreshadowing for Kris attacking their friends of their own volition. Mr. Double Dan argues the slash is drawn left to right. This makes it impossible for the Knight to be the originator of the attack, given where we last saw the Knight.
But the slash is clearly angled to be from the left to the right. It's pretty obvious that that's what this slash is. And look, I made a version of it where it's actually from the right to the left. Doesn't it just look more natural for what the knight would be doing?
He goes back on this in his follow-up video, instead saying it makes more sense for it to be drawn right to left, and that also means Kris did it, somehow.
I was very focused on it being from the left to the right since that seems the most natural for that effect, but I could see it possibly being in the exact opposite direction as long as it follows the same path. But guess what? This arc is centered around where Kris is, not the knight. So Kris could be the one attacking in the opposite path that I first suggested. And guess what? This interpretation explains the knockback to the left.
My point in showcasing this to you is to illustrate two things: hypocrisy and the semantic nature of this argument. No matter where you stand, whether you believe Kris, the knight, or God did it, you can come up with a reason why you're right because of the scene's ambiguity. Citing the /PNG itself as evidence for your correct interpretation is dumb. Next, Ralsei's dialogue, or what I consider to be the best supporting evidence for Kris Slash. After Susie is swooned, Ralsei runs up to her and says, "How could you?" Kris Slash believes this is Ralsei's shock over Kris clobbering Susie.
Now tell me, in what world would Ralsei ever say this if the knight just did like a normal fast attack?
While there are other ways to interpret this scene, I feel this is my weakest point. There is something about Ralsei's dialogue I find too accusatory to completely write off as coincidence. However, the points made surrounding this dialogue to further support it are bad. In the follow-up video, Mr. Doubledan attempts to further strengthen this point. He says Ralsei's face sprite is looking up, so he can't be looking at Susie.
It really seems like Ralsei is talking to Kris here and looking at Kris, and not Susie and not the knight. For example, they used a face sprite where Ralsei is looking directly at the screen, implying he's looking forward and not down. And just before this, when he calls out for Susie, that sprite is looking down.
Look at all of these Ralsei sprites. Count with me how many of them are facing forward. Now count how many of these Undyne sprites are facing forward. Noelle now. These face sprites, because of the way the base of the sprites are drawn, default to looking forward. Face sprites, by design, are meant to be reused too, making the argument that Ralsei can't be looking down at Susie because he's using two shocked sprites that were created for Chapter 2 that happen to be looking forward is dumb. Ralsei's sprites are looking forward, and we can see Ralsei's face, and he's not looking forward. So this point is The other point made to support Ralsei's dialogue is a deus ex machina. To surmise, Mr. Doubledan believes Ralsei knows the difference between the player and Kris through the prophecy. Because of this, Ralsei chooses to ignore Kris's actions. Ralsei's too prophecy-pilled is a cop-out answer that can be applied to Ralsei anytime he might inconvenience your theory. Bringing this all together, the Ralsei dialogue itself is the strongest piece of evidence in favor of Kris Slash, but all of the points made to further support that dialogue suck. Toriel has a nightmare not because Kris hurt their friends, but because, by defeating the knight, we are dooming Kris to an ill fate. If you are unaware, Toriel has two different blurbs that change depending on the outcome of the fight. Later, in Chapter 4, Susie mentions Toriel having a sixth sense for when Kris is doing something wrong. Mr. Doubledan concludes that means Kris is doing something bad in that scene, aka hurting their friends. This completely ignores an observation made by Mr. Doubledan earlier in the video, one I find way more plausible and compelling. Have a listen.
This is just speculation from me, so it's okay if you think I'm a little bit off here, but I think that the weird route will require all 4 shadow crystals from chapters 1 to 4. Sham says that we will be able to use the shadow crystals from these chapters to create something we will enjoy. And there just so happens to be an item that we don't know anything about yet called the Pure Crystal, which is found in the fuse options. But what does this get fused with? The Thorn Ring, a weird route exclusive item. I think the Twisted Sword is going to be necessary for the weird route, and the only way to get it is to get all the shadow crystals.
Essentially, shadow crystal acquisition could be bad, actually. Since these new chapters have dropped, and even before, with the exception of Gerson, freedom has been associated with the player being evil and Kris's turmoil. See Chapter 4, Chapter 4 again, Chapter 3, Chapter 3 again, and Chapter 2. A lot of us assumed that freedom was somehow a good thing for Kris, but actually they really hate it and hate you for making them progress progress toward it. The only two parts of this game with heavy motifs of freedom are the weird route and the secret bosses. Basically, what I'm attempting to imply here is our preconceived notion that defeating all of these secret bosses is a good thing may not be correct. Maybe getting shadow crystals is a bad thing that condemns Kris and co to an ill fate. This argument is further strengthened if you believe shadow crystals are in any way linked with or necessary for the weird route. Given that, why believe Toriel is having nightmares over Kris clubbing their friends in the back of the head, something I continue to illustrate doesn't really have the greatest amount of supporting evidence, and instead believe Toriel is having nightmares because the acquisition of shadow crystals could have further reaching, terrible implications.
Okay, but actually, Mr. Doubledan, what is with the venom in regard to prediction? You touted your sword route idea as better because it is current and already correlated to something. But it's unfounded in all realities. Predictions can be more founded than a faulty correlation. A correlation does not equate to more validity. My real beef with this theory is how nearsighted it is. It was the same with Kris Knight too. Kris Knight looked at all of the evidence, completely ignored that 5/7 of the game had yet to be released, and concluded Kris had to be the knight because what else could all of the evidence mean? If the game ended at chapter 2, sure, Kris Knight makes sense, but the game doesn't end at chapter 2. Toriel's nightmare and the minigame interpretations make sense if the game ended at chapter 4, but it doesn't end at chapter 4. The prediction is more founded than the correlation.
The final piece of evidence for Kris Slash is Kris being knighted. Mr. Doubledan believes Kris becomes a sort of second knight in this knighting.
Which means Kris is now the Knight of the Prophecy alongside this Roaring Knight. I think now there's pretty much two of them.
Kris opens a fountain, Kris is referred to as the Knight by Tina, and Kris acts in opposition to the party. In doing all of these things, they're knighted, becoming another Knight of the Prophecy. This secondary knight idea is also kinda supported through some imagery we've seen, except this is completely ridiculous. Kris opens a fountain because they are aligned with the knight, yes. However, Tina does not refer to Kris as the knight. Kris relays a deal from the knight to Tina, a deal that ostensibly includes Kris as well. Just because Tina says our deal does not mean he was obscuring Kris's identity elsewhere, making the obfuscation interpretation fall completely flat.
Also, it's kind of like a correlation and a parallel to Spamton, but like, who gives a about that, right?
And, of course, I don't believe Kris slashed, so this last point also falls completely flat. This entire knight idea seems to be an attempt to make more out of an event that is already revelatory. The only reason we know Kris is, for certain, without a doubt, no ambiguity, 1000% working with the knight is because of this scene. Is that not big enough of a deal as is? Why does it have to be Kris Knight 2.0? Frankly, I think Kris Slash Theory reads like someone coming up with a cool conclusion or cool idea and trying to justify said conclusion or idea by looking backwards with a selective lens rather than coming to a conclusion based on ideas or evidence they were presented with. Get what I mean? There are more reasonable and founded explanations for just about every piece of evidence that Kris Slash provides, and where there isn't outright debunk, there is alternate interpretation. It is a theory founded primarily on misinterpretation of the text and semantics. Ultimately, I believe it is easily disregarded.
A few quick things here. I want to quickly reiterate that I have nothing against Mr. Doubledan whatsoever. I know I kind of dig at him several times throughout this video, but I have nothing against him as a person. I just think his theory isn't very good and worthy of criticism. I will also reiterate that if you go out of your way to harass him or any video that perpetuates Kris Slash, you are of the devil and deserve to rot forever. These are theories about a video game. In the end, we are all passionate about it and sharing our love for it. Unrelated to that, soon I will be live streaming both here and on Twitch reacting to comments. The date for this will be on the screen. If you want to participate in that discussion, comment your comment and look out for that stream. I'll make a community post about it as well. All relevant links to my social media and other oddities lie in the description. Peruse at your discretion. Thank you for watching.